So this evening, we're going to go ahead, and we might not go through everything, but we'll at least get started going through our wonderful carbohydrate chapter. So specifically, we're going to talk about the roles of carbohydrates and obviously the reason why we care about it, especially in certain athletic endeavors more than others. Obviously, we remember we're going to store glycogen really in 3 different types of cells in our body. So obviously muscle and liver are going to be the 2 big ones we're caring about for exercise. But what's that 3rd type of cell where we're going to store some glycogen? What's the 3rd type of cell in your body that's going to store some glycogen? Take a wild guess, somebody. Now, when it goes into fat cells, it's going to be converted into fat and stored as fat. So it's no longer stored as glycogen. Good shot, though, Jake. It's actually, Paige, you're right. It's the astrocytes inside of the brain. That's where you're going to store glycogen as a fuel source. So it turns out your brain is going to have a ready supply of carbohydrates you can use for energy. Now, that being said, we're always constantly trying to regulate our blood glucose because it's very important because it's a major fuel source for our nervous system. Now, between muscle glycogen and liver glycogen, which of the 2 can't be utilized by any other cell type than the cell it's inside of? Yes, it's the muscle. So the good news is once we store the glycogen in the muscle, it's ready, it's in that fiber, and it's good to go. Problem is we can't put it anywhere else if we maybe put it somewhere where it shouldn't be. So liver glycogen, once we break that down, we can put that into the bloodstream and we can utilize that for energy. We're going to talk about how much we store in a little bit. Now, you guys can see this image where we have hexokinase. It's that first enzyme in glycolysis that is going to convert glucose into glucose 6-phosphate. From there, now that glucose is phosphorylated, it can't leave the cell. It's stuck. So it's either going to be stored as glycogen or used as fuel. Now, what's interesting is we have what's known as glucokinase, which happens to be in the liver. This happens to turn on and phosphorylate and dephosphorylate glucose. So we can free it up so it leaves, hence it's useful somewhere else, or it's stuck in the cell. Now, what's interesting is this enzyme is going to activate at 4 times the concentration of glucose inside of the cell compared to hexokinase. Now, why would it be important that we have to go to 4 times the concentration of glucose in the cell before the liver hexokinase is going to be active compared to the muscle hexokinase is active? And this is going to be based on, or gives us the idea of what's known as triage theory. What's the importance there? Cass, go ahead and take a shot.
I was actually just looking it up. So you said something about the triage theory, right? It says that a strategic rationing response has been selected through evolution, which ensures that moderate shortage of V and M, I'm guessing it's vitamins and minerals, is encountered. The scarce vitamin and minerals is preferentially retained by those vitamin and minerals dependent protein and enzymes that are essential for survival and reproduction.
Okay, now what does that mean?
So I'm guessing that it's just saying that functions that are for vitamins and minerals are managed by something like that.
Okay, no, that's okay. That's okay. So the idea of triage is we're prioritizing things. So we have, this is our most important, this is our second most important, this is our third most important, and this, if we get to it, we get to it. So it's effectively your body putting everything in order of importance. So since hexokinase in your muscle is 4 times more sensitive, that means it's going to take up glucose at a much lower glucose level than what the liver is going to take it up, which is a good thing. If it's so low, your muscle isn't really trying to take it up unless we're exercising, which is artificially lowering it anymore. It's going to let that go to your brain. Now, if the levels get to be pretty high, then we're going to top off that liver glycogen, because now the liver is got enough that it can essentially top itself off. So this is a problem, obviously, when people aren't taking in enough carbohydrates and potentially, obviously, enough calories in general. So this is a good thing because we prioritize making sure our nervous system has what it needs first. Then we prioritize getting muscle glucose so we can use for energy. And then if we've got enough extra, we'll go ahead and get it to the liver. Does that make sense? Good. Now, when we're exercising, we're going to be going through our glycogen depending on the intensity. So notice, if somebody's going to go out 31% at 31% of their VO2 max, notice estimated time, and this is a mistake. It shouldn't say hours, it should say minutes here, but they make mistakes. I just leave them because they're entertaining to me. After 3 hours, notice you're about 50% of your starting glycogen. Like, you're okay, but you're obviously depleted. You wouldn't want to go out and do that again. Now, after 2 hours at 64%, we're talking about being down, starting off at somewhere between 80 and 90 and being at only about 20. So you're at about a quarter left in the tank. And the key is glycogen is not like just the fuel tank. As you burn it down, you get the same amount of gas as you're pulling. You actually, as you burn it down, you can only take it up at a slow rate, because remember, you're not having as many branches. So you're slowly starting to prune branches off until you're only pulling from a few and the enzymes can't work as quickly. Now, we jack that up to 83% of our VO2 max for effectively 1 hour. Notice, same type of situation, we have decimated it. And then if we're talking about only going at 120, 150% of your VO2 max, which is insane, we're talking intermittent sprinting followed by, trying not to vomit and crying excessively, you're going to deplete it obviously even faster. So we need to have strategies where we can effectively replace it. And so the longer you've been working out, the higher intensity, the faster we're going to be essentially releasing glucose from our liver, so we can try to offset some of that losses and that we're chewing through inside of the muscle. And if we go too low with our blood sugar, this is referred to as hypoglycemia, and we're going to talk about some of the symptomology there. So hypoglycemia is referring to your blood glucose levels. The muscle being the major thing that's going to chew through it quickly, not that you're not using it in your red blood cells and in your nervous system, but when we're exercising, that's what's really decimating those blood glucose levels, and replacing it from what we take in our diet, as well as what we can free up from our liver, as well as what new carbohydrate we can make through gluconeogenesis inside of the liver. So, like anything else, carbs are really important for high intensity exercise. Do you need them for high intensity exercise? No. Would you prefer them? Absolutely. And like anything else, it depends on the amount of work you're doing and obviously the duration. So if you're just going to be a power lifter, just do a couple heavy singles and doubles, you don't really need that many carbs. If you're trying to do more bodybuilding style training, you're trying to do things that are very lactic oriented, you're going to need some carbs, especially if you're going to do well. Okay. Notice, because it's fuel for the brain, things that are cognitively demanding are going to become literally more difficult. So there's a lot of ways that we're going to approach to optimize carbohydrate intake. So we're going to get not just the best performance, but best practices from our athletes. Okay. Now, it's a relatively easy thing to do. It can be difficult to consistently apply it. Okay. So we do want to make sure we're taking enough carbohydrates in the days before, as well as we want to make sure that we're doing a feeding that's tolerated before exercise, so we can effectively top off our glycogen stores in our liver and in our muscle. So we're also going to give carbohydrates as tolerated, which we're going to learn there's going to be a limited amount we can tolerate per hour when we're exercising. And we want to then make sure we're replenishing glycogen about as quickly as we can after exercise. So that way we're going to replenish glycogen, which is also going to help a little bit with muscle protein synthesis, having enough fuel inside the muscle so we can actually repair the damage that we've incurred from our training. So that liver glycogen store, Okay, this is the only one that we're pulling from to bring our blood glucose levels back up. Okay, and what we're going to find that, once again, our nervous system really only prefers to use glucose. It can use ketone bodies. We're going to talk about ketogenesis when we get into fat. So most humans are going to store about 80 to 110 grams of glycogen in the liver when we're in a kind of a good, well-fed state. Now, we multiply that by 4, we're going to get how many calories of carbohydrate we have in there. So 440 grams of carbs, that's not bad. That's, you figure your average 154-pound European male, that's enough to cover 4.4 miles. It's not bad. That's definitely not enough to do a half marathon. It sure isn't enough to do a marathon. So we're going to break it down, release it in the bloodstream, and utilize it accordingly. Notice the muscle glycogen isn't leaving. Once it's there for good. So when we start working out, okay, we're going to decrease that muscle glycogen pretty quickly. Okay. So notice losing about half of it with only exercising for 1 hour at about 75% of that VO2 max. Okay. It's going to become more important for regulating blood glucose the longer we're exercising, because remember, we're not going to be able to free up that glycogen in the muscle as rapidly as we could before. And we can remember, go through gluconeogenesis, where we're going to make new carbohydrates by utilizing some of that lactate in the blood, as well as glycerol and some amino acids. Typically, alanine is one of the larger ones that's utilized a lot. So from there, once we've gone through gluconeogenesis, it's going to be released again. So we can kind of have a bit of a cycling from lactate that we're producing at the muscle to the liver, back into glucose, back to the muscle. Glycerol, that's going to be released along with the 3 fatty acids. 3 fatty acids go in the bloodstream. Glycerol goes to the liver, gluconeogenesis, glucose goes in the bloodstream, gets used by the muscle. Now, we're going to find that at rest, we're not really giving up much glucose or glycogen from our liver, because it turns out the demands aren't that high. But notice it's going to ramp up massively when we start getting into higher levels of exercise intensity, as well as it's going to also ramp up gluconeogenesis. So, and we're going to really top it out effectively, where at the highest levels of output, it's mostly going to come from breaking down glycogen, because we can't undergo gluconeogenesis that quickly. And if you remember way back from ex-phys, you actually need to utilize a lot more oxygen in order to make new glucose. So that's why it had like an RER score of like 0.6. So what we have here is what's known as the glucose index, specifically a chart. And this is going to be looking at the total amount of effectively how quickly carbohydrates are going to hit your bloodstream once you've eaten them. So certain foods that have a higher GI are going to hit our bloodstream much more rapidly. And that can be very useful, because it turns out once we get done training, we want to help replenish glycogen, or we want a simple carbohydrate when we're working out. So that's where you see your high GI foods, things that are going to rapidly enter the bloodstream in a relatively short period of time. Okay. So you see some fruit, you see a lot of processed foods, and you also see things like potatoes. Now, on the other side, we have our low GI, and this is going to be coming from foods that are still some processed. We're definitely getting more into vegetables, and it's usually things like fiber and fat that are going to slow down the rate of absorption. So our low GI carbohydrates is typically what we want to try to utilize the other hours of the day. Immediately pre-workout, peri-workout, and post-workout, high GI carbs, absolutely. That 2 to 3 hour time before exercise, where we want to eat a little bit to avoid exercise-induced hypoglycemia, which we're going to touch on also in a bit. We want to go ahead and probably do more moderate to low GI carbs. And then low GI carbs are really useful with people that you're trying to go and do weight control, because it's going to keep that more even balanced blood sugar for them. It's not going to give them a hard spike. So they're typically not going to have that response of just kind of feeling really hungry, because their blood sugar is going up and down and making rapid changes. So when it comes to utilizing carbs, if we're really trying to maximize glycogen stores, which is absolutely a good decision if we're going to do something like repeated competitions on the same day, or we're looking at doing things like a marathon or otherwise, we want to load carbs high. So we have in the bottom left is one of the older classic research from Dave Kostel and his group out of Ball State, where when groups of runners had to do, notice it's a 16.1 kilometer run. So Colleen, you want to convert that into American for us?
Yeah, 16.1 kilometers is probably like 10 miles.
So notice they were doing these 10 miles every day. So we see the low carb diet, we have that depletion of glycogen. The high carb diet, you see how they're losing a little bit of glycogen, but not much. They're pretty much managing to maintain their starting levels. Okay, and notice millimoles, so that's a chemistry term for essentially how much concentration of something we have per kilogram of dry weight muscle. So it's just how concentrated the glycogen is in your muscle. Now, notice here, when it comes to glycogen synthesis, when we add protein, you're going to increase the glycogen synthesis rate. But notice, if you just added more carbs in the first place, that's where you're getting the lion's share of your extra glycogen synthesis. You get a little bit more if you add protein in there. The reason you want to add protein to post-workout nutrients, which we're going to get into more later, and specifically in the protein chapter, is it helps more with that recovery of the damage to those tissues. It's not so much going to be that much of an advantageous aspect to increase your glycogen. Instead, you're better off just taking in more carbs in the first place. Okay. And now when we look over in the bottom right, we can see the total amount of glycogen that an athlete has. And this is playing soccer. So it's 90 minutes all out. And this is from Bank Saltine and also in the early 70s. In that individuals in the high carb diet and the normal diet, they were pretty much empty, but see how much higher they had as far as glycogen. But what's more importantly is notice the total distance they covered and the markedly higher amount of that distance that was spent sprinting in the group that happened to be on the high carb diet as opposed to the low carb diet. Can you guys see that okay? Does that make sense? Good. So if we're going to be out there for a really long time, this can be out hiking, marathon training, Ironman, etc., we really want to make sure that we're giving people a carbohydrate source. Because, like anything else, if we're not taking enough glucose in, we're going to start to show symptomology of hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is not fun. We have a happy, yes, Josh, that would be the Reader's Digest version of it. Now, it's also going longer and harder without taking a break. So if we're just doing, like I said, a bunch of really heavy singles and doubles, and it's a lot of volume, but we don't go at a very high rate, you're not really chewing through that much carbohydrate at that rate. You got to worry about it. But if you're doing a lot of hard lactic work where you're getting that burn in the muscle and otherwise, we're going to be chewing through it. So it's relatively normal. No, you're probably not at that high of an intensity. Okay, yes, you are. Let's go ahead and put this in perspective. If we went for a jog, all of us normally fed, we're going to start hitting the symptomology of hypoglycemia, most of us, after we've probably been jogging consistently for probably in the neck of 2, maybe 3 hours, depending on how fast we're going. That requires 2 to 3 hours of jogging. Aside from Colleen, I don't think many people here have jogged for 2 to 3 hours straight in a long time. If I'm wrong, please call me out. Good for you, Cass. When's the last time you did that?
So it was June 15th.
Mm-hmm.
So just a couple months ago, but still.
Good. How did you start to feel any of these symptoms, or did you bring carbs with you?
Oh no, I definitely started feeling them. I'm not the most efficient runner.
It has nothing to do with being efficient. We were out there for that long, no matter what. Everybody's going to be depleted. So that's why, like, using goos, using blocks, using Gatorade, using different carbohydrate strategies is incredibly important for pretty much any athlete you're going to meet that's going to be out there. I can appreciate that, Josh. So in those situations, you want to make sure that we're giving buddies something in order to make sure that we're going to maintain it. Now, notice the last line there, which is pre-exercise carbohydrate feeding can induce reactive hypoglycemia. See, the problem is if we do a really big, especially a high GI carb meal from about 1 hour before the exercise really starts to about 20 minutes before, that food goes into our digestive system, goes in obviously through the duodenum and everything else. And now that blood is now in, or the carbohydrate, glucose is in our blood. Once that glucose is in our blood, it's now going to cause our body to release what hormone? Insulin, absolutely, Paige. And so now that we've released insulin, now our blood glucose level is coming down. Then we start exercising, which is going to cause blood glucose to go down even faster. And that's where folks can have what's known as rebound hypoglycemia. This doesn't mean don't eat before you train. It means we have to time it. Okay, so it's doing something light right when we're getting going, or making sure we're taking that last meal about 2 hours ahead of time. So we're not going to have this effect. So we really want to make sure that we're taking in enough carbohydrates to support the training volumes and intensity that someone happens to be doing. So if you're a normal person working out, we don't have to worry about this. If you're sedentary, we definitely don't need to worry about this. But if you're someone that's doing multiple workouts per day, you're going for long runs, you're lifting weights for a couple hours, you're doing those things, then we need to make sure that we are fueling ourselves appropriately. The answer to your question, Josh, is yes to both. So when you eat is going to affect both your volume of training and the total amount of food you're going to be eating. Now, this is going back to, now we're going to talk about digestion that we talked about earlier. We don't want to do giant boluses. So if you're doing crazy amounts of volume of training, doing 1 meal per day is going to be this giant meal that is going to be definitely not optimal for glycogen resynthesis, as well as it's just going to be really hard physiologically to put down all of that food. Now, if we break that up over something like 4, 5, maybe even 6 meals, depending on certain situations, it's going to be a much less daunting task and much easier to go ahead and keep ourselves in a better fed state. So we're going to be able to perform on a higher level. So when we're working with anyone, we want to get an idea of how much work are they doing. When we know how much work they're doing, now we can go ahead and divide up those carbohydrates they're going to need throughout the day. Obviously, put some in pre-workout, peri, so during workout, and post-workout. So we're going to optimize glycogen resynthesis and give them the best performance that they can have. Now, we might not always use this. We want to avoid these tactics maybe a little bit in the off season. So we're going to try to rely proportionally on fat a little bit more as a fuel source. However, when we're really talking about trying to get an athlete to perform, that's when we go with the high carbohydrate intake. So in that example, when we're talking about these athletes, this is where we have these basic outlines of about 5 grams of carbs per body weight or kilogram body weight per day on the easy days. And then from maybe as high as 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram body mass on the heavy days. Notice, guys, 4 or more hours of hard training in order to get there. So most folks aren't even doing the easy training. So the reason why I keep harping on it is we want to always make sure our carbohydrate intake is appropriate for the demands the athlete actually has. Not because we just want to pound down a lot of carbs, because we actually want to increase performance, and we don't want to do it in such an attempt that's going to be detrimental, because they're going to be effectively gaining more weight, or like anything else, most of us typically can only eat so much food per day. We want to prioritize the macronutrients that are important for health and recovery. So if we're pounding down all these carbs and we're stuffed from it, what macronutrients are possibly living in the dust? Good. Fat and?
protein?
Absolutely. Depends on your source of carbohydrates. If you're someone that really likes a bunch of rice, you're not really getting any protein or fat at all. If you're doing things like potatoes and whole grains, yeah, you're getting a little bit more protein, but quite possibly not enough. And if you're doing all of your carbohydrates from candy bars, then, well, yeah, they're getting fat and carbs, probably not getting any protein. So if we're doing a really big competition, something that we really care about, this is where we want to do some carbohydrate loading. Now, it depends on the competition we're talking about. So for example, what Colleen does with cross-country running, yeah, we probably want to do some carb loading, nothing too extensive. But if we're going to go and run a marathon, do an Ironman, we want to go ahead and super compensate. So we're going to do a massive carbohydrate load. So we're going to be able to have our glycogen levels far beyond topped off what they normally are. So what we have here, guys, is two different approaches to that glycogen super compensation. One is miserable. I've done both. So the first one effectively is you go super low carb and you do depleting workouts. And then the 3 days before your competition, you eat carbs like they're going out of style to top off that glycogen. And then you bring it on your competition day. Now, the kinder, gentler version is going to be where we're going to taper. So we're slowly going to do less volume as we're stepping up our carbohydrate intake. So we're going to peak out that glycogen while we're also slowly doing less work. Now, this methodology, in my experience, has been a good one to work with athletes that are doing things that is a weight class sport, because we're going to glycogen deplete. And for every 1 gram of carb, we store at least 2.7 grams of water. And it's actually a little bit higher than that. So if we deplete our glycogen and we do that weigh in at the appropriate time, and then super compensate our glycogen later, we're going to make weight, but then we're going to gain all that weight back through carbohydrates, and we're going to have that weight class advantage. Mind you, that's for sports that give you like a 24-hour weigh-in. When you're dealing with athletes that are not weight class sport, that's where the kinder, gentler approach is typically going to be your better option. Now, when it comes to that intake and practice, guys, we want to make sure we're dividing those carbohydrates up throughout the day, getting in an adequate amount at each of the meals to support what we're going to do and replenish what we've used. So we're going to get into the basic recommendations of how we're going to do this in a few. But remember, could be 5 grams per kg of body weight per day, all the way up to 10 or 12. And technically, if you want to go ketogenic, it could be 0. Wouldn't advise it, but you can do it. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. They just make life a lot easier, a lot easier. So if we're trying to really restore that glycogen, okay, we want to make sure that we're taking in carbohydrates effectively as rapidly as possible. Now, about that 1 hour after exercise is when we want to make sure that 1 hour window after exercise is when we actually replenish glycogen at the highest rates. So that's why post-workout meal, specifically a high GI carb, so it's going to absorb rapidly, is really, really important. But then making sure that we're dividing up those carbohydrates throughout the rest of the day, because we can only take in a finite amount of carbohydrate per hour. We're not going to be limited. We've only got so many transporters in our GI, guys. So we want to make sure we're not taking it in all the time. Now, fun fact, thanks to being female and where you're at in your cycle, you actually are going to have a slightly different storage of glycogen. Now, if you're drinking alcohol, that's also going to put a damper in your glycogen replenishment and also potentially lead to dehydration. And if we have muscle damage going with it, it also is going to negatively affect our ability to replenish glycogen. So that's why if we're doing a real hard competition, we want to hit a taper. We want to do an easy workout that week so that we're not doing extensive muscle damage. Instead, we're getting our tissues to super compensate. So we're going to get a better performance from ourselves. So in general, we want that last real meal to effectively be in that 3 to 5 hours, maybe as close as 2 hours outside of competition or exercise. When we're getting in that shorter period before, we've got a much higher risk of issues with going hypoglycemic. And we want to be aware of what type of GI carbs. High GI carbs, immediately pre-exercise, peri and post. Moderate to low GI carbs pretty much throughout the rest of the day. And not being afraid to space it out between more meals. Absolutely, Josh. because you've done a greater volume. And what we're going to find is individuals' natural hunger drives, sorry, something stuck in my teeth, are linked to the amount of work that they're doing. So if you're going and you're not really exercising, you're not really doing much, it's normal to not be very hungry unless you're completely sedentary, then you get dysregulated. But until you get to like insanely high, like 8 hours a day of physical activity, you tend to, if you move more, get more and more hunger desire from the body. Now, a couple graphs up here that are important to understand. First and foremost is, go figure, taking a higher carbohydrate amount, we're going to burn more carbohydrates per hour. Wow, shocking. Now, notice, guys, oral carbohydrate oxidation rate. So how quickly we break down the carbs orally and how much we're taking in per minute. See how we get to a point where we can really only metabolize about 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per minute. So doing any type of carbohydrate beverage that's taking in more than that usually ends up being about 70 grams of carbohydrates per hour. We can get around it, as we're going to learn in just a moment. We want to make sure that we're not taking in more than our body can handle, because you're going to have GI upset if you have all these carbs in your GI, but you can't actually take it in because we're running out of transporters. Now, remember, when we talked about digestion, we've got glucose transporters and we got fructose transporters. So notice, going from medium to high glucose, there was no change in the glucose oxidation rate. However, when you add fructose, you now get the fructose oxidation rate, which means you literally can chew through more carbs in a minute. And that's why a lot of sports drinks will have either sucrose, which is glucose and fructose, or glucose and fructose plain by itself in there. And what's also fun is lactate is a 3-carbon sugar. So you can even also add that to your beverage to enhance your oxidative rates and your performance. Unfortunately, lactate obviously has a lot of negative press around it, so a lot of people aren't really interested in utilizing that to enhance performance. So 3 to 5 hours out, we're going to have that carb-rich meal. Guys, 330 grams of carbohydrate is a lot. That is a lot. We're talking about over 1,000 grams of carbs, so we can improve that performance. Now, we can do a lot of different types of foods that are moderate to simple carbohydrate. To give you guys an idea of that low end, okay? We can have, now, of course, this is written from a British perspective, so we can call that oatmeal, okay, with milk, a banana, and orange juice. Or we can just do a lot of bread with jam and honey, because cool. And yes, other options. This amount of food can be a little daunting for some athletes. We've got to work with them to figure out what they're going to be able to tolerate, but it still gives you some ideas. Now, when we're exercising, we do want to keep in mind, guys, that we are limited, and some folks can go a little bit faster. They have a bigger GI that's more robust. Some folks are going to go slower. You know, smaller GI, they can't churn through as many. So we want to make sure that we're going to practice this with our athletes. Make sure that we don't be like, yeah, you got to do 2 goos per hour. And then they like, I feel nauseous. I got all these stomach cramps, because you're not getting enough blood flow to allow you to metabolize that carbohydrate at that rate. So the types of carbohydrate, simple is going to be your friend. Complex carbohydrates obviously are going to take a little bit more to break down. There are some products out there like Vitargo and otherwise from UCAN and other companies that is going to be a little bit more of an even blood sugar, which is going to be useful for some folks. But when in doubt, experiment with it. Make sure it agrees with your athlete's GI. And remember, if we can't transport it, we can't move it. So we have to make sure that we're not outrunning what we can. We understand that glucose, fructose, and lactate all use different transporters. Glucose and galactose are the same transporters. So using milk as a peri-workout carbohydrate, not a great choice, because you're just going to max out. And like anything else, this is going to allow us to have a greater amount of carbs that we're going to preserve from our intramuscular glycogen for longer, as well as avoiding that hypoglycemia for a greater amount of time. Now, what's really interesting of recent date is there is work where literally giving individuals just a mouth rinse of carbohydrates. So not actually getting the carbs in the body, but they get to swish around like Gatorade or something in their mouth and spit it back out. And literally, this helps enhance performance. Okay. So part of it is giving us that reward, but second of all, being like, oh, we got more carbs incoming, we can blow what we got. So it allows individuals to actually have higher power outputs, literally over over an hour of performance just by giving them that mouth rinse. Now, if you're doing the same thing with that pre-event meal, that's going to be high carb. It's actually potentially going to work up against you because remember that hypoglycemia reaction and the higher intensity, remember the less blood flow you have going to your GI, the harder it's going to be to maintain that output. So the good news about exercise is it's going to cause activation of these GLUT4 transporters to translocate to the cell membrane to allow more glucose to come in the cell, as will insulin. This is a great way that we can naturally kind of work to help control things like type 2 diabetes. However, it's specific to the muscles we're using and the muscle fibers inside of that muscle that we happen to be using. So immediately post-exercise, we have a much greater amount of sensitivity to taking in carbohydrates. So you can see giving someone glucose immediately post-exercise gives us a much faster synthesis rate than if we just waited 2 hours, where you can see we're no longer getting that same robust response. So it's important that we're going to refuel our athletes about as quickly as we can after strenuous exercise, especially if we know we have to do repeated bouts. Do we care about this with your average person? No. Do I care about this if I was working with a professional soccer team, if I was working with a professional basketball team, any athletes that have to play very frequently? Absolutely. So we have that rapid phase for about an hour, and then we're into that slow phase where we're not going to be synthesizing as quickly. So we want to make sure we're taking those carbs, not necessarily post-workout, maybe at the end of the workout if it will be tolerated. Because the second we ingest the carb, put it in our mouth and swallow it, we still got a good 10, 20 minutes before it's going to be in our bloodstream. So utilizing a carbohydrate beverage, if tolerated during the workout or at the very end of the workout, specifically during the cool down, can be even more advantageous to help them with it. Going with a simple carbohydrate, high GI carb, so it's going to be readily available to go inside of the body. Using protein on occasion as a means to help with not just glycogen recovery, but also muscle protein synthesis for additional muscle recovery. And when it comes to solid versus liquid, what do you think is the best bet to go with when it comes to post-workout?
Solid.
Why would you say that? And Paige, why would you say that?
To be honest, I'm going on a hunch.
That's okay.
I was gonna say liquid just because they're already, if you're post-workout, you're probably already dehydrated. So then you need some of that water, as well as I feel like you could probably absorb it easier. And some people cannot tolerate eating after exercise. So that's another thing.
And Josh, what's your argument?
I would say more or less that if somebody is on an empty stomach, they would want something to fill that void.
So, and like most good arguments, it depends. So some folks using a liquid carbohydrate is a much more advantageous because it's so easy and it's so portable. Other folks would prefer to sit down and actually have a real meal. Or obviously something that's really high carbohydrate. This is where you could do something like Pop-Tarts. You could do something like candy. In fact, that's quite frequently what I use as my post-workout carbohydrate. I've been doing a lot of red licorice recently. Kind of been on, I don't know, been in the mood for that. It works. So the key is you need to match what's going to work with your athletes. Some folks get done training and they don't even want to freaking chew. So that's where liquid is going to obviously be very advantageous. Some folks, once again, yeah, like you said, Josh, they want to actually chew and have real food. They're tired of just doing everything through shakes. The key is don't become dogmatic, become pragmatic. Technically, liquid is going to probably be a bit more optimal because it's a faster delivery route. However, you need to match it appropriately with your athlete. There's no point in giving them a shake if they're not going to take it. So thank you both for contributing. So remember, guys, like anything else, we've only got a finite number of transporters. So if we only take in a single type of carb, aka just glucose or just fructose, we're going to overwhelm that single transporter. So we want to use more than one, so that way we can get in through more than one transporter. And so we're going to have the highest rates when we're taking in both glucose and fructose, as opposed to just one at a time. Now, we've got a couple graphs here, but these are also very important in that notice what we have here is different things we can do in order to enhance performance once we go ahead and get going for effectively how many carbs we're talking about, depending on how far you're going. So if we're just doing something for half an hour, we don't need these damn strategies. It's not worth your time. If you're going to be training, once again, with relatively high intensity without stopping, yeah, we can maybe do small amounts. We're going to do the mouth rinse if we're only going for about an hour. Then once we're talking about that hour to 2 hour gap, we should probably be taking down at least 30 grams per hour minimum. And notice we can go single or multiple transport or multiple types of carbohydrates. Now, once we get over those 2 hours, we're going to bump up that recommendation because there's no way you're maintaining over too high of an intensity for 2 hours like that. So now we're definitely talking multiple types of transportable carbohydrates. And then when we're getting well over that 2.5 hour mark, now we're talking about 90 grams per hour because we're not going at too high of an intensity that we're not going to be able to replenish it. So now we're talking people doing a marathon, people doing an Ironman, etc. So when it comes to that glycogen synthesis rate, once we take in a certain amount of grams, notice per kilogram of body weight per hour, we're effectively peaking things down. It usually seems to be at about the 1.2, because you can see how after that point, we've kind of gotten to the flattened part of the curve and we're taking it about as quickly as we can. So, and this is another way to graphically see that immediately post-exercise high glycogen synthesis rate, as opposed if you just try to wait that 2 hours. So doing the carbs immediately post-workout is going to be very, very important. So notice, guys, for 4 to 6 hours after, about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass. So you can space it out, do an immediately post-workout meal, and then have a real meal another hour or two down the road, because like anything else, we're going to saturate out our transporters, which is fun. Because if you think about it, you can only do 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per hour. That means in theory, a 220 pound man, so a 100 kilogram guy, can take in 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour, which means if we just want to redline your GI for 24 hours, hypothetically, it's going to change and it's never going to be this predictable. But that means we can take that 120, multiply that by 24, and now we've got 2,840 grams of carbohydrates in a day. Oh, or 2,880 grams of carbohydrate over the course of a day. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that to you. But hey, the more you know. So it's easy to say you're not limited on how many carbs you can take in per day. You're not going to see them in the toilet bowl a second time unless something's going horribly wrong. But now let's talk about things that can go bad if you're taking in too many carbs and why we care about things like your blood glucose level. Now, I'm sure all of you guys are very familiar at this point with type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes. What's the problem? Why is there the frowny face with the really high glycogen levels? Blood glucose levels, my apologies. And why we care about what's known as A1C. A1C is a type of protein inside of your red blood cell. That's why it says HB hemoglobin, A1C. Carbs are actually going to bind to it. And we see higher proportions of it with people that have had higher on average amounts of carbohydrate per day as they're going through, and a higher blood sugar. Why is that bad? Now, that's going to be one of the causative reasons why we get there. But why is high blood sugar in and of itself a bad thing? Yes, it does give you hyperglycemia. Why is hyperglycemia a bad thing? Cells can use it. There's just way more than they need. it's definitely hard on your cardiovascular system, but we need to think about why it's bad. Yes, Mandy, absolutely. How does it damage your blood vessels? Yes, part of it is our blood viscosity is going to go up because we're effectively starting to pump something that's more reminiscent of maple syrup. Not a great thing. The other thing that we're going to get, it can still move through, but what we get is what's known as glycosylation. So glucose is going to start binding to things that it has no bearing, or it has no bearing, no point in it shouldn't be bound to. So it'll start binding to proteins, and it'll start creating essentially its own little glucose type spheres that'll do damage to your endothelium. Hence, really high blood sugar can cause neuropathy, lead in things like gangrene, as well as doing damage to our blood vessels, causing things like atherosclerosis. So what happens is we get a little bit of that nicks and cuts from those carbs going through, effectively, once again, pushing crystal sugars through your blood, through the inside of your blood vessels, which is kind of like letting little razors go through. And then that inflammation, our body's going to put down effectively those clots as a way to protect it. And obviously, over a long enough period of time, you're not going to have a good time. Okay. So, wow, we went through all the slides. Huh, that's cool. Well, okay, let's have a little fun now, guys. So we've got 4 different scenarios here that we're going to put you guys into breakout rooms. What I want you guys to come up with effectively with this information is going to be how you're going to have your individual scenario, okay? Spacing out their carbohydrates through the day. So we're going to optimize performance for their training. Okay, that's the first key we're going to focus on. But then we're going to divide up those carbohydrates thoroughly throughout the day, so we're not having to do effectively too big of a bolus. So, for example, with a bodybuilder who's doing 500 grams of carbs per day, it's really, for some bodybuilders, that's not going to be very high whatsoever. But if you had to just do one meal of 500 grams of carbohydrate, that's going to be kind of daunting. So it's going to be the equivalent of, I think that's going to end up being like somewhere in the neck of at least 6, I think more like 8 cups of rice, one meal. That's a little excessive. Instead, how are we going to divide those carbohydrates up throughout the day? So it's never going to be into a meal that's just got too much bulk. And you guys can choose however many meals you want to give them. I would suggest at least 3, preferably 4. So we've got 3 normal meals and then a pre-peri post-workout meal. Have some fun with it. It's 6:49 now. We'll plan on coming back at somewhere between 6:55 and 7, and we'll see what you guys came up with. Does anybody have questions? So group 1 is the 500 mgs, group 2 is the 400, group 3 is the 300, and then group 4 is the 100. Any questions? As we just lost somebody. Okay, well, room's open. When you guys are ready, go ahead and hop on in. I'll see you guys back in a few minutes and we'll talk through what we came up with. All right, guys, whenever you're ready, go ahead and post what you guys came up with in the chat, and we're going to kind of talk our way through the decisions you guys came up with. Nice, nice. Tyler, I like that. Nothing too daunting. 5 sweet potatoes, that is a lot of sweet potatoes. Maybe a little bit more carbs around the workout, but I think that's a pretty good balanced approach. That nothing there is excessive. I like it. I like it. Okay, so group 2, 3, and 4, where are you guys at?
I can just like say what we thought.
Okay, go for it.
So we were group 4 and we had 100 per day, which is really like not that much.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we didn't come up with like exact like stuff like they did with like the oatmeal and stuff, but we thought probably like 30 grams before the 1 hour of cardio and then 30 before the 1 hour of weight training. And then after that, eat 40 so your body can like synthesize that and you can get ready to go again the next day.
Yeah. And then the other meals, tilapia, spinach, and sadness. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, you guys probably did it where I do it. I might weigh a little bit more carbs around the workout, the lifting than the cardio, because cardio is gonna be done at a low intensity just for fat loss, because they're going to be running in a deficit, but we want to make sure that we're getting those carbs to go to the muscles they're using. So throughout the rest of the day, yeah, low or negligible carbs, maybe like 5 grams of carbs that they just get from eating the sad spinach goes with it. So that's not bad. That's not bad, Hannah. Your group did a good job as well. So, oh, and sourdough bread, because we don't like just normal bread. We're fancy. I like it. Yeah, and then a cup of spaghetti with a breadstick. And then during practice, they've got that Gatorade, and you guys have the soccer player. So good. Yeah, absolutely. And that's okay. And so notice that that's where you see your cliches, your pastas, your rice, those type of carbohydrate options for things so we can get folks to, match those demands. And so last but not least, Jake, London, Mandy, and Morgan, what you guys come up with?
So we didn't get finished, but let me pull it up.
That's okay.
We were looking at where it said on the slides like carb intake 3 to 5 hours before exercise, and it said around like 140 to 330 grams. So we kind of based off a little bit from that. So we have the triathlete doing 1.5 hours of distance training in the morning. So we wanted them to give them a good amount of grams. We didn't do specific foods. We were trying to add it up by grams. So like 100 grams or something for like before they work out, 3 to 5 hours before they work out, and then work out. And then for lunch, we just kind of threw in 100 grams. And then for dinner, 140 for 3 to 5 hours before they work out again, because they have the night training. And then we wanted to give them a post-workout meal to kind of replenish. So around like 60 grams. And because we only had 400, so we added it up.
Awesome. Good approach. With people that are usually doing that type of crazy high volume of aerobic work, that morning is going to be like first thing in the morning, roll out of bed, hop on the bike, get on the road or jump in the pool, and then go hard. So maybe a light snack kind of on their way getting in, and then trying to do some type of carbohydrate beverage or otherwise during the training, and then have a real meal to resynthesize that glycogen post, and that'll effectively be what would be really a breakfast. Then having a traditional lunch, which you guys divided there, and then that night session is probably going to be one of those things that's kind of pre-dinner. So maybe a light snack at the beginning of the workout, carbs peri, and then once again, the big meal post. Now, I didn't give you those details, didn't say the exact timing, so that's where you're going to be able to be a little bit more precision on your carbohydrate intake. But I think you guys got a decent starting point of where you go through. And 400 grams for somebody that's doing like really high volume training is laughably low. That would be for maybe 100-pound triathlete. So we could have much, much higher carbohydrate intake in those situations. So we're going to match the demands, but make sure we're splitting it up over the meals. And I think you guys did a good job. So another thing that I didn't talk about that I definitely want to make sure I touch upon is the fact that overnight we actually empty our liver glycogen stores, because that's what's regulating our blood sugar while we sleep, along with gluconeogenesis. So when you wake up in the morning, your liver glycogen levels tend to be relatively depleted. Your muscle glycogen hasn't been used. You've been sleeping. So you're cool. And if anything, it's maybe been resynthesizing depending on how big the meal was, how long it took your body to digest into the evening. So when we get up, that's why it's important to either do that light snack that's going to be tolerated, or immediately take in a meal that has carbohydrates so we can get that blood glucose to go up, and in turn get that glucose to go into the liver and those muscles that still need a little bit more glycogen resynthesis so we can still perform on a high level. Now, Obviously, we covered a lot of nuance here and a lot of it depends, but also giving you guys some pretty straightforward effects on how to go about things. What questions, comments, concerns do you have with me about carbohydrate? And then after that, we're done. You guys are gonna have hopefully a nice evening. And we got people leaving. Cool. Well then, guys, stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves. And yeah, I will see you guys obviously next week. And we'll keep going through it. And please bring your questions on the exams. We will go and talk through. We're definitely going to talk about everything that goes into calories in and calories out and how one influences the other, because that is, it's okay. It's a thing that a number of folks have been struggling with, but we're going to go through it. So stay safe out there. See you guys then.